Good. Welcome to the sermon from Elk Grove Presbyterian Church in Elk Grove, California, on this third Sunday after Epiphany, January the 23rd, 2022. For those who are gathered here and for all who are watching this from wherever you are, let us continue to be very cautious. Wearing masks where appropriate, keeping social distance, I'll take that off here, but these are just difficult times. We want to be responsible of ourselves, we want to be responsible to those others who are around, and that's just so important. So today's gospel reading is from the 4th chapter of Luke, verses 14 through 22a. It's a recount of the first presentation, public presentation that Jesus made in Luke's account in that synagogue in Nazareth, and the people's response to those. What we're reading today is just his opening words, in response to that. This is really a part of a two-part series, because next week we will read about the next part of that opening address that he made and the people's response to those words. All right, very different. This is kind of a mini drama in two parts. And before next week, I encourage you to read the second part of the drama, which is verses 22 through 30. This takes place after Luke's account of Jesus' baptism and then his experience in the wilderness, where he was tempted or tested by the devil. As I read today's lesson, and think about this week and next week, I would encourage you to keep two thoughts in mind, okay? Think about these first. Generally, people want to hear what they want to hear. I'm not so keen on hearing what they may need to hear. Right? Second thought, a real friend is one who will hold up a mirror to you so that you can take a good, hard look at yourself. Okay? So listen now to the Word of God from Luke. So it starts with just a summation of after the desert experience. When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. And he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he said to them, "Today, the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. This is the word of the Lord. Help us understand your word, Lord. Wanting to hear what we want to hear, not so keen on hearing what we may need to hear. That's a part of our emotional, psychological makeup, isn't it? Seems to be pretty consistent among us human beings, sorts. Good news, bring it on. Let me hear it. Mama, maybe not quite so good a news. Well, can you put that off for a little while? Bad news. Do I really have to deal with that? Can't I just avoid it? Denial is wonderful. And as they say, denial is not just a river in Egypt. Okay? Well, I suspect each and every one of us can identify with those feelings. I suspect each and every one of us has experienced the joy of hearing good news and the pain of hearing bad news. Bad news about ourselves, bad news about those we love. Bad news that may even make us reconsider basic understandings about ourselves, about others, even about God. Good news. That's what we want to hear, isn't it? Maybe like someone saying, I really appreciate you. Well, that feels good. Not so good if we hear someone say, we need to talk. Had a minor experience with those a week ago when I saw a dentist for, I must confess, probably the first time in 5 or 6 years. 7? Well, after the x-rays and the teeth and gum exam, he said, overall, your teeth and gums are in pretty good shape. Yes, that's what I wanted to hear. Good shape, good shape. Wait, that's not what he said. He said, overall, pretty good shape. Oh, didn't want to hear that. What he said was, well, there's a little cavity that needs attention. No big thing. Cavity fill, so all was good. But it was kind of that, would have preferred to say you're absolutely perfect. No problems whatsoever. And it's that good news, bad news dynamic that is a framework for this week's and next week's sermons, all right? Based on Luke's account of the people's reaction to Jesus speaking in the synagogue in Nazareth. People liking what they heard in the verses that we read this morning. We'll say more about that. Not liking what they heard in the verses we'll read next Sunday. So go ahead and read the rest of that section about his time in Nazareth. Luke tells us that after his desert experience following his baptism, Jesus went around Galilee teaching in synagogues, and as Luke says, everyone praised him. Now we hear about his visit to his hometown, Nazareth, and going to the synagogue there. Synagogues, as you know, are basically community centers, schools, places of worship. Okay? Those were in the local communities spread throughout Israel. Very different than the temple in Jerusalem, which is a place of the ritual sacrifice. The synagogues was where there was teaching going on, dialoguing, questioning, that kind of thing. So Jesus would have grown up in that same synagogue there in Nazareth. That's where he would have learned how to read and speak and understand the Hebrew language. Though he had grown up speaking the common language of the time, Aramaic. Learned a different language, just like Catherine down in Honduras, growing up speaking Spanish, now learning English. Well, there are other languages around. Maybe he had some knowledge about the language in which the New Testament was written. Did I bring it out? No, that was Greek, of course. So from the Aramaic translated into the Greek, and the other language, of course, that was prevalent was Latin by the Romans who were there. So lots of different languages, lots of different religious and cultural backgrounds represented by those different languages. It was sort of a first century melting pot in that way, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. And it was within that melting pot that Luke recounts Jesus' inaugural address, as it were, using words from Isaiah to set the tone and direction of his whole ministry. That's kind of, you take his summation, and that comes right from Isaiah. I was reminded that speaking or teaching in a synagogue in Jesus' time was open to anyone who the leaders of the synagogue deemed to be properly educated in the scriptures and in the Jewish tradition. It was a very democratic operation, okay? Didn't have professional staff in synagogues. You had people who helped run it and kind of leaders who would oversee it. Well, obviously those leaders had apparently heard about what Jesus was teaching in other synagogues, and they were very comfortable inviting him and having him speak. And it was also clear that from what it said a little bit, many people remembered him. That's where Jesus had grown up. He was a young boy. They remember him playing with other kids his own age. Remembered him as a obviously very bright school student in that synagogue. Remembered him working as a carpenter beside his father. So they were probably very anxious to hear from this hometown boy. What's he going to say? And they were obviously pleased to hear him read in the Hebrew from Isaiah and then say in Aramaic, that promise has been fulfilled right now in your hearing. That would have pleased them. Although the reading in Isaiah was related to the return of the Jews from the captivity in Babylon like 500 years earlier, that reading also spoke to their own hopes in their own difficult times. There they were, living under the rule of the Roman occupying force, living under the local rule of the pseudo-Jewish kings appointed by the Romans, needing to abide by the rules and the rituals of the often very hypocritical religious leaders. And they were burdened with taxes. Taxes to support those Roman forces, taxes to support the lavish and corrupt lifestyle of those hated kings, taxes to help meet the demands of the religious aristocracy down in Jerusalem. So they heard those words that Jesus spoke about good news to the poor and freedom from the prisoners and release of the oppressed. And they thought, that's us. He's speaking about us. We who are poor and oppressed and feel like prisoners in our own land. He's saying that day is coming when we'll get rid of those Romans and false royalty and religious know-it-alls. And as Luke wrote, all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Jesus was tying together their sacred scriptures from Isaiah, their history as a people, and then their own current experience. All right? And combined, those gave the people a sense of their identity. In a very real sense, Jesus gave those people what they wanted to hear. The reassurance of their special connections to God, no matter how difficult and uncertain their lives might be right then. So you have sacred texts, you have tradition, you have their experience. And together, those are what gave those hearing him their understanding of who they were right there. 2,000 years later, those are still essential in creating our understanding, our identity, as individuals, as groups, as a church, as a nation, as God's creation. Sacred texts, tradition, experience. And each one of those can take very, very different forms for us at different times in our lives. As Christians, of course, our primary sacred text, of course, is the Bible, particularly the New Testament. That is our primary source for learning about Jesus Christ and the early church. And that's why for the last 7 years that I've been with you, I've chosen to base my sermons on the lectionary readings in the Gospels, to become more attuned to the Christ revealed in those sacred texts. But I also think that sacred texts could be any source that helps us do two things: to become more aware of and open to the wonder and amazement and the mystery of that unfathomable force and love which we call God. Whatever helps us in that way. And whatever helps us to become more open and loving and gracious towards others. Right? Sacred text. Well, I got to say, what are other sacred texts in one way or another for me? I hope you read that piece that I sent out this week from James Herriot, that vet in Darrowby, Yorkshire. I just found his recounting of that Christmas Eve absolutely beautiful. I was just really struck by it. That's kind of a little bit of a sacred text for me. I mentioned Frederick Buechner's. I used him a lot. Those become kind of a sacred text for me, or Richard Rohr, or Howard Thurman, and many others along the way. Even sometimes Calvin and Hobbes. Moments in the back, I said, that's beautiful. And I suspect that each of you have sources or texts that have had a sacred impact upon you. And thank God for each and every one of those. You know? Years ago, I would read to Keegan and Connor when I would be putting them to bed. That included The Hobbit, Call of the Wild, The Old Man and the Sea, some others. Years later, when Keegan was in college, he tutored a young Korean American student in English and reading and writing. Keegan told me that he had that student read, guess what? The Hobbit, The Call of the Wild, Old Man and the Sea, because Keegan said, because those are some of my sacred texts. Maybe not so much because of the books themselves, but of the sacred time that we had together. So sacred texts, whatever they are, as a church, along with the Bible, we could add writings such as our creeds, other contemporary writers that we appreciate. Think of that as in terms of a nation. What are our sacred texts? Well, primarily I would say the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. You need to look at those and take them serious. Likewise, with traditions or experiences, our personal or family or group traditions and experiences that help us understand who we are. You know, do we wear our tartan colors on occasion? Well, it's a part of our tradition. Our history as a church, whether it's Elk Grove Presbyterian Church or the Presbyterian Church USA, or the Universal Church. What are our sacred texts? Our history as a nation. Think of all the things in our history that if we listen to, they can help us understand who we are. So, like those listening to Jesus in that synagogue in Nazareth, how we understand ourselves, and how we relate to other people and to the wider world, how we understand and choose to live under God's grace and love and acceptance, those depend upon how we accept and integrate in what we do with those things we consider our sacred texts and our tradition and our experience. And I believe that the gospel of Jesus Christ can be like a friend who holds up a mirror to us, to allow us, to challenge us to take a good, hard look at ourselves, which is not always easy, is it? Helps us look at whether we are becoming more and more opening ourselves to God's love and God's grace, and are we becoming more open to others? Or are we drawing the circle smaller and smaller and smaller, closing in ourselves, closing out others, closing out God, closing out our own emotions, our own needs? Those are what we'll consider next week as we read the second part of what happens in that synagogue in Nazareth. But from today's reading, the first part, may you and I live in the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. May you and I be willing to hear where the gospel is calling us to. Thanks be to God. Amen.